What you're about to witness defies everything experts know about predator and prey relationships. When Marcus Sullivan's rescue cat started bringing home wild wolf cubs one by one, it sparked a chain of events that would transform not just his life, but challenge everything scientists believed about animal behavior and healing. The morning mist clung to the dense forests of northern Montana, where the small cabin of Marcus Sullivan sat nestled among towering pine trees, 20 miles from the nearest town of Cedar Falls. Marcus, a 34-year-old Army veteran, had chosen this isolated location deliberately after returning from his third deployment in Afghanistan 2 years ago. The silence of the wilderness provided the peace his mind desperately needed after years of combat zones and the constant alertness that military service had ingrained in him. Marcus had served as a combat medic with the 82nd Airborne Division, specializing in field trauma care under extreme conditions. His hands had saved countless lives in the chaos of war, but the weight of those he couldn't save haunted his quiet moments. The transition back to civilian life had been brutal. The constant noise of cities, the crowds, the unpredictability of daily life all triggered responses he couldn't control. Sleep came in fragments, interrupted by nightmares that left him exhausted and on edge. After struggling with therapy sessions that felt hollow and medications that dulled everything, including the good memories, Marcus made a radical decision. He used his military benefits to purchase a remote cabin on 40 acres of pristine Montana wilderness. Here, surrounded by the natural rhythms of the forest, he found something resembling peace. His days were structured around simple routines: chopping wood, maintaining the property, reading, and taking long hikes that sometimes lasted entire days. His only companion was Shadow, a 3-year-old black Maine Coon cat he'd adopted from a shelter in Billings. Shadow had been found abandoned as a kitten, feral and distrustful of humans, much like Marcus felt about society. The cat's independent nature and quiet presence suited Marcus perfectly. Shadow roamed the property freely during the day, an excellent hunter who kept the cabin free of mice and rats, but always returned by evening to curl up by the fireplace. The veteran's background in emergency medicine had made him acutely observant of changes in behavior and patterns, skills that would prove crucial in the extraordinary events about to unfold. The harsh Montana winter had been particularly brutal that year, with temperatures dropping to -30 degrees Fahrenheit and snow accumulating to record levels. The Forest Service had issued warnings about unusual wildlife behavior, as the extreme cold forced animals to venture closer to human settlements in search of food and shelter. Marcus monitored the weather reports on his battery-powered radio, noting how the persistent storms were disrupting normal migration patterns and feeding cycles throughout the region. In the third week of February, a massive blizzard system moved through the area, bringing winds that howled through the trees at 60 miles per hour and dumping over 4 feet of snow in less than 48 hours. Marcus had prepared well, stocking his cabin with enough supplies to last several weeks, but even he was surprised by the ferocity of this particular storm. The power lines serving the remote area snapped under the weight of ice and falling branches, leaving him completely dependent on his wood stove for heat and battery-powered devices for communication. On the second night of the storm, Marcus heard sounds that made his combat-trained instincts snap to attention. Through the howling wind came the unmistakable calls of wolves, not the distant howls he occasionally heard during normal winter nights, but desperate, distressed vocalizations that spoke of animals in crisis. The calls seemed to be coming from multiple directions, suggesting a pack had been scattered or was under severe stress. Shadow's behavior changed dramatically that night. The normally calm cat paced restlessly around the cabin, his ears constantly swirling towards sounds Marcus couldn't detect. The feline's agitation was unlike anything Marcus had observed during their 2 years together. Shadow refused his evening meal and spent hours stationed at the main window, his yellow eyes scanning the white darkness beyond the glass with an intensity that bordered on obsession. When the storm finally broke on the 4th day, an eerie silence settled over the landscape. The usual sounds of the forest, bird calls, small animal movements, even the whisper of wind through branches, had vanished entirely. Marcus stepped outside to assess the damage and was struck by how the snow had transformed familiar landmarks into an alien landscape. Trees he'd known for years were buried or bent at impossible angles, and the normal pathways through his property had disappeared under uniformed white drifts. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work, so if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. The temperature had plummeted even further in the storm's wake, creating conditions that would challenge even the most adapted wildlife to survive. 3 days after the blizzard ended, Marcus woke before dawn to Shadow's urgent yowling echoing through the cabin. The cat was positioned at the back door, his tail bristled and body language conveying an urgency Marcus had never witnessed. When he opened the door, Shadow immediately bolted toward the tree line, looking back repeatedly as if demanding to be followed. Marcus grabbed his heavy winter coat, boots, and the medical kit he always carried, a habit from his military days that he'd never abandoned. Following Shadow's tracks through the deep snow proved exhausting, but the cat's determination was unmistakable. After 20 minutes of trudging through drifts that reached Marcus's knees, they arrived at a natural depression surrounded by fallen logs where the snow had blown into massive drifts. Shadow sat perfectly still, staring at a particular spot where the snow seemed disturbed, his breathing visible in small puffs of vapor in the frigid air. Marcus approached cautiously, his trained eye immediately recognizing something was wrong with the landscape. Using a fallen branch, he began carefully probing the snow where Shadow indicated. What he discovered made his breath catch in his throat. Beneath 18 inches of powder lay 3 wolf cubs, so young their eyes were still closed, huddled together in a pathetic attempt to preserve body heat. Their mother was nowhere to be seen, and there were no adult tracks visible in the surrounding area. The cubs were barely alive, their breathing shallow, and their tiny bodies cold to the touch. Marcus's medical training kicked in immediately as he assessed their condition. They appeared to be approximately 10 days old, far too young to survive without constant maternal care. Hypothermia was setting in, their body temperatures dangerously low, and they showed signs of severe dehydration and starvation. In normal circumstances, these cubs would have died within hours of being abandoned. What puzzled Marcus was how Shadow knew exactly where to find them. Cats typically avoided wolves, viewing them as natural enemies. Yet Shadow showed no fear, instead displaying what could only be described as protective behavior toward the vulnerable cubs. The Maine Coon positioned himself between Marcus and the cubs initially, as if guarding them, before seeming to understand that Marcus intended to help. The discovery presented Marcus with an impossible situation. Wolf cubs required specialized care that went far beyond basic animal first aid, and keeping wild wolves in Montana was illegal without proper permits and facilities. Acting on pure instinct honed by years of battlefield medicine, Marcus carefully gathered the 3 cubs into his coat, creating a makeshift warming pouch against his body. The trek back to the cabin felt endless as he fought to maintain his footing in the deep snow while protecting the fragile lives pressed against his chest. Shadow led the way with purposeful strides, occasionally stopping to ensure Marcus was following, exhibiting behavior that seemed almost deliberate in its protective nature. Inside the cabin, Marcus's emergency medical training took over completely. He immediately began warming the cubs gradually using towels heated by the wood stove, knowing that rapid temperature changes could send their tiny bodies into shock. Their breathing was so faint he had to place his ear directly against their chests to detect heartbeats. Using supplies from his comprehensive first aid kit, he fashioned makeshift feeding bottles from syringes and began administering warm sugar water in tiny drops, a technique he'd learned for treating severe dehydration in human infants. What happened next defied every expectation Marcus had about animal behavior. Shadow, rather than showing territorial aggression cats typically displayed toward unfamiliar creatures, began an extraordinary maternal routine. The Maine Coon positioned himself next to the cubs and began grooming them with gentle licks, stimulating their circulation and digestion exactly as a mother wolf would. Shadow's rough tongue seemed to awaken survival instincts in the cubs, encouraging them to move and make small whimpering sounds. Throughout the first critical night, Shadow never left the cubs' side. He arranged his large body around them like a living blanket, sharing his body heat while Marcus maintained their feeding schedule every 2 hours. The cat's purring created a constant vibration that seemed to comfort the orphaned wolves, and Marcus noticed their breathing became more regular when Shadow was close. By morning, all 3 cubs had survived their first 12 hours in human care, largely due to the unexpected partnership between the veteran and his feline companion. The cubs began to show distinct personalities, even in their weakened state. The largest, whom Marcus mentally designated as Alpha, showed the strongest feeding response and most active movements. The middle cub appeared more cautious, often staying closer to Shadow's warmth, while the smallest struggled with coordination but displayed remarkable determination to survive. Shadow seemed to sense each cub's individual needs, adjusting his position and grooming attention accordingly. As the cubs grew stronger over the following weeks, their survival created increasingly complex challenges that Marcus hadn't anticipated. Their appetites increased dramatically, requiring specialized puppy formula that had to be ordered from veterinary suppliers in Billings, a 3-hour drive through treacherous mountain roads. The cubs' natural wolf behaviors began emerging as their eyes opened, and they started exploring beyond their makeshift den area near the fireplace. Marcus found himself walking a dangerous legal tightrope. Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks conducted regular patrol flights over remote areas, and keeping wild wolves without permits carried severe penalties, including substantial fines and potential jail time. He installed blackout curtains and modified his daily routines to minimize any signs of unusual activity around his property. The stress of concealment brought back familiar feelings from his military service, the constant vigilance, the hyper-awareness of sounds and movements that might signal discovery. The cubs' relationship with Shadow continued to evolve in ways that challenged everything Marcus understood about interspecies dynamics. The Maine Coon had essentially appointed himself as their surrogate parent, establishing feeding schedules, grooming routines, and even discipline when the cubs became too rambunctious. Shadow would gently but firmly pin down any cub that strayed too far from the designated safe area, using his paws and body weight in a manner remarkably similar to how adult wolves manage their young. Local residents began noticing changes that made Marcus increasingly nervous. Sarah Chen, who ran the general store in Cedar Falls, mentioned during his monthly supply run that several customers had reported unusual animal sounds echoing through the forest at night. The cubs' howling was becoming stronger and more frequent, especially during early morning hours when their natural instincts were most active. Marcus realized he couldn't muffle these sounds indefinitely without the cubs becoming distressed. Dr. Jennifer Whitehorse, the area's only veterinarian, had started asking pointed questions when Marcus purchased increasing quantities of specialized animal medications and supplements. Her professional curiosity was clearly aroused by his unusual requests, and Marcus sensed he suspected he was caring for something more significant than a domestic cat. The small-town veterinarian had built her practice on knowing every animal within 50 miles, and Marcus's secretive behavior was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain. The cubs were growing rapidly, their playful wrestling matches becoming more intense and their natural pack behaviors asserting themselves in ways that strained the cabin's capacity to contain them safely. The crisis Marcus had been dreading arrived on a cold March morning when the smallest cub, who had always been the most fragile, suddenly collapsed during their morning feeding. The tiny wolf's breathing became labored and erratic, his gums turning an alarming pale color that Marcus recognized as a sign of severe internal distress. His combat medic training told him this was beyond anything he could treat with basic supplies. The cub needed immediate professional veterinary care, or it would die within hours. Marcus faced an impossible choice that tore at everything he'd built since leaving the military. Revealing the cub's existence to Dr. Whitehorse would almost certainly result in their confiscation by state authorities, potential criminal charges against him, and the destruction of the unique bond that had formed between Shadow and the wolves. But allowing the cub to die when medical intervention could save it violated every oath he'd taken as a medic and every moral principle that had guided his life. The internal battle raged for precious minutes as the cub's condition deteriorated further. Marcus found himself experiencing the same paralyzing anxiety attacks that had plagued him during his worst post-deployment periods. The racing heart, the sense of walls closing in, the overwhelming weight of responsibility for lives hanging in the balance. His hands, which had remained steady through countless battlefield emergencies, trembled as he tried to make the most difficult decision of his civilian life. Shadow made the choice for him. The Maine Coon suddenly picked up the dying cub in his mouth with extraordinary gentleness and carried it directly to Marcus's truck, depositing it in the passenger seat before sitting beside it with unwavering determination. The message was unmistakable. Shadow understood the stakes and was willing to risk exposure to save the cub's life. With no time left for deliberation, Marcus wrapped all 3 cubs in blankets, loaded them into his truck with Shadow, and began the desperate race to Dr. Whitehorse's clinic in Cedar Falls. Dr. Whitehorse took one look at the dying cub and immediately shifted into emergency mode, asking no questions as she rushed the tiny wolf into her treatment room. Marcus watched through the observation window as she worked with practiced efficiency, inserting an IV line smaller than a thread and administering medications with the precision of someone who had saved countless animal lives. Shadow refused to leave the treatment area, positioning himself where he could observe every procedure while somehow staying out of the veterinarian's way. After 2 hours of intensive care, the cub's breathing stabilized and color returned to his gums. Dr. Whitehorse emerged from the treatment room, her expression unreadable as she studied Marcus with penetrating dark eyes. Rather than the confrontation he expected, she surprised him by saying quietly, "I've been wondering when you'd show up here with them. Wolf cubs don't just appear out of nowhere, and your supply purchases told quite a story." The revelation that Dr. Whitehorse had suspected the situation for weeks initially terrified Marcus, but her next words changed everything. She explained that she was not just a veterinarian, but also a member of the Blackfeet Nation with deep cultural connections to wolf conservation efforts. Her grandfather had been a traditional healer who understood the sacred relationship between humans and wolves, and she had spent years quietly documenting the return of wolf populations to Montana without alerting authorities who might respond with unnecessary aggression. Instead of reporting Marcus to Fish, Wildlife and Parks, Dr. Whitehorse proposed an extraordinary solution. She had been working with Dr. Michael Reeves, a wildlife behaviorist at the University of Montana, who was researching innovative rehabilitation techniques for orphaned predators. The unique bond between Shadow and the wolf cubs represented exactly the kind of interspecies relationship that could revolutionize wildlife rehabilitation programs. Dr. Whitehorse contacted Dr. Reeves immediately, and within days, Marcus found himself at the center of an unprecedented research opportunity. Rather than being prosecuted, he was offered a position as a wildlife rehabilitation specialist using his medical background and the remarkable relationship he documented between Shadow and the cubs. The university would provide legal permits, proper facilities, and funding for a groundbreaking study on cross-species fostering techniques.
The program would allow Marcus to continue caring for the cubs while contributing to scientific understanding of animal behavior and developing new methods for saving orphaned wildlife across the region.
6 months later, Marcus stood in the newly constructed Wildlife Rehabilitation Center on the university campus, watching through reinforced glass as Shadow methodically groomed the now adolescent wolves in their spacious outdoor enclosure. The facility had been designed specifically around the unique relationship he documented, featuring observation areas that allowed researchers from around the world to study this unprecedented interspecies bond. The cubs, now named Kodiak, Sierra, and the smallest survivor, Spirit, had grown into healthy juvenile wolves while maintaining their extraordinary connection to their feline surrogate parent. Marcus's transformation had been as dramatic as the wolves' development. The nightmares that had plagued him for years had gradually diminished, replaced by a sense of purpose he hadn't felt since his military service. His work with Dr. Reeves had evolved into developing protocols for emergency wildlife rescue that combined his combat medical training with innovative animal behavioral techniques. The steady routine of caring for the wolves, documenting their progress, and training other rehabilitation specialists had given structure to his days, while allowing him to use his medical skills in ways that saved lives rather than simply treating war wounds. The research findings had exceeded everyone's expectations, attracting attention from wildlife conservation organizations across North America. Shadow's maternal behaviors toward the wolves had been documented in over 200 hours of video footage, providing unprecedented insights into how domestic animals could serve as surrogate parents for orphaned wildlife. The Maine Coon had taught the wolves essential survival skills, including hunting techniques, social hierarchies, and even danger recognition that would have been impossible to replicate through human intervention alone. Dr. Whitehorse had become not just a colleague, but a trusted friend who understood Marcus's journey from isolated veteran to wildlife conservation advocate. Together, they had established a network of rural veterinarians and wildlife specialists who could respond to similar emergencies throughout the Rocky Mountain region. Their program had already saved dozens of orphan animals, from bear cubs to injured raptors, using modified versions of the techniques Marcus had accidentally discovered in his cabin. The most remarkable outcome had been Spirit's complete recovery and integration with his siblings, despite his near-death experience. The bond between all three wolves and Shadow remained unbroken, creating a unique family structure that challenged traditional understanding of predator relationships and had become the subject of multiple published research papers that were reshaping wildlife rehabilitation practices worldwide. The story's most extraordinary chapter unfolded exactly 1 year after Marcus first discovered the cubs in the snow. As part of their rehabilitation program, the time had come to prepare Kodiak, Sierra, and Spirit for gradual release back into the wild. The process would be heartbreaking, but necessary. Wolves belonged in their natural habitat, not in captivity, no matter how loving that captivity might be. On release day, something unprecedented happened that left even Dr. Reeves speechless. As the enclosure gates opened to the vast Montana wilderness, the three wolves didn't immediately bolt for freedom as expected. Instead, they approached Shadow one final time, each gently touching noses with their feline father, in what could only be described as a formal goodbye. Shadow sat motionless, accepting their farewell with the dignity of a parent watching children leave home. The wolves disappeared into the forest, but trail cameras placed throughout the region continued to capture their progress. Most remarkably, they had formed their own pack rather than seeking to join existing wolf families, unprecedented behavior that researchers attributed to the unique social structure they'd learned from Shadow. 6 months later, Sierra became the first of the siblings to have cubs of her own, successfully raising them in the wild using survival skills taught by a house cat. Marcus, now 36, had found his calling as one of Montana's leading wildlife rehabilitation specialists. Shadow, approaching his 5th birthday, had helped raise 12 more orphaned animals, earning recognition as the most successful surrogate parent in wildlife rehabilitation history. The cabin that had once sheltered a struggling veteran now served as a field station where Marcus trained other veterans in wildlife rehabilitation techniques, creating purpose and healing for those, like him, who had lost their way after military service. If this incredible true story of healing, hope, and the unbreakable bonds between species touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel for more amazing rescue stories. Share this video with anyone who needs reminding that sometimes the most broken among us are capable of the greatest healing, and that family comes in forms we never expect.